Hello and welcome to Suzi's Book Bag, hosted by me, Suzi Fay. Today's tote bag is from a new YA imprint coming from HarperCollins called Magpie. And I chose it because it has this faintly mystical air, which I like. And I also chose it because I came across a great line in the book that we are going to discuss, which is memory is a sly magpie. This idea of picking up things that glitter. And it's very pertinent to Tom Cox's book Villager, which we will be discussing shortly. I first came across Tom, as so many people do, I'm sure, on Twitter, where he tweets very entertainingly about all kinds of things. And I knew immediately that this was a guy after my own heart, somebody who tweets about quizzical sheep and deep Devon lanes, mysterious portals, moors, contorted trees, all those wonderful things, ghosts, legends, myths. So I knew that I would enjoy Villager, and I know I'm going to enjoy talking to the author of Villager, Tom Cox. Well, so Tom, where are you speaking to us from? Are you in the West Country?
I am. I'm quite far down. I'm in Cornwall, but only temporarily. I'm here for another 5 months. I've just been renting a house, as I do slightly because I want to write about the area and research it. This is something that I just keep doing. I've lost count how many houses I've lived in now. I think if you count childhood ones, it's something like 26.
Right. Wow.
And it's quite exhausting, all the moving, but sort of accidentally at first, so it's an accidental thing at first, which was sort of, oh God, you've got to move because you can't afford your house anymore, or you move because of a relationship or work or something. But then I started kind of embracing this sort of semi-nomadic lifestyle, because it became really good for my writing, just turning up at a new place and really exploring the landscape immediately around you, like getting the OS map out and doing every walk in the vicinity. And then you start writing about all the folklore, all the landscape nearby. And I just seem to keep doing it now. I mean, it's not financially justifiable at all, but I look at it and look at like the last 5 books, and it's made the last 5 books I've written a much more interesting experience.
In terms of fiction, Villager is a novel, and you've also written a book of short stories, Help the Witch.
Yeah.
But you have done quite a lot of non-fiction as well. Do you want to just run us through your non-fiction titles?
It's a long and very kind of eclectic journey, which doesn't make a lot of sense to people, really, because a lot of people who've come in, I mean, it's what is it now? It's 13 books now. So, and a lot of people who've come in more recently, you go back and you say, well, I wrote 2 books about golf, and they're kind of like, what the fuck? So that's actually where I started. I was a music journalist, and I quit that, and I got a book deal, which was for a memoir about my misspent golfing youth called Nice Jumper, which came out when I was about 9. And it's kind of all right for something that I wrote when I was very young. But I wrote it for a very big publisher, kind of in the way I was told to write it. So I did that, and then I did a couple of music books, which I tell people not to buy, because again, I don't feel like they really properly came from the heart. I feel like that I was more kind of like doing what I was being told by the publishing industry.
They were commissioned, and
yeah, I mean, I understand why I did it, because you've got to get by, you've got to pay the rent, and also I was speaking to people who were from a very different background to me, a very, very more educated background, people from London who kind of, I just thought, well, they know best. They know that I have to do this. I can't do what I really, really want to do. So I did that. Then I wrote some books about cats and beyond. It was almost like a way of me writing about my cats, but smuggling lots of other themes into it. And I did that for quite a while. And then so that takes me to, that's 8 books in. So it's 2 golf books, 4 cats and beyond books, 2 music books, which if you're watching this, please don't buy them, they're crap. And then like I've done 5 books with Unbound, which I don't know what you'd call them. They're really very much my own thing. They're nature writing, landscape, folklore, bits, mundane bits about everyday life, or lots of stuff mixed in, and also 2, as you said, 2 works of fiction, which are Help the Witch collection of short stories and Villager, my first novel. But I always wanted to write fiction, desperately wanted to write fiction. I thought I was going to be allowed to do it when I was like 26, but it turned out I had to wait till my mid-40s to be permitted to do it, but which has kind of been a good thing in a way.
A lot of things that you've written and enthused about do weave their way into the fiction. I actually probably did first come across you with tweets about My Sad Cat, an unfeasibly lugubrious feline whose pleading eyes would look out from your photos, which I always thought were hilarious. So I did think this is a man after my own heart. I think. Have you got a visiting cat? Or maybe this is in one of your other locations, but I was intrigued by the huge cat who has invaded your home recently.
No, he is current. Me and my partner, we kind of said we've got 2 cats, and we sort of thought, you know, that's fine. That feels about right. It's not excessive. Even though we are people who just want to adopt every cat, want to rescue every cat. But word got out that we were a bit of a soft touch when we moved here. And first, a huge black cat came in and was nicking our cat's food, and we sort of tried to adopt him, but he's a bit nervous, so he didn't really want to stay. But then straight after that, our cat Charles, tabby cat, he brought back this massive ginger cat. This was about December the 2nd, and it's late April now. And it was like he brought him back. He said, here's my new mate. I brought him back to the house, and he just like ran straight into our arms, like on this day, and he's never left. And he lived in a barn up the hill before, and he's just so not a barn cat. I mean, he rarely even goes out. He's actually quite needy. He's a bit much sometimes. He just wants to be like on you all the time. And he's the size of a small horse. So it's a bit difficult, really. But he's absolutely amazing. He's a total pacifist. He's sort of he's that kind of strawberry blonde ginger. And he used to be called, apparently it was called like Mongo, which was, I'm guessing, a Blazing Saddles reference. But he's not a Mungo at all. He's Jim. He's totally Jim. he's become Jim, and he's a total pacifist. And the ginger cat from across down the hill beats him up all the time. Who's about half the size of him, but he won't fight back. He's a lover, not a fighter.
Yeah, well, he certainly takes a good photograph as well. Now on to Villager, which I was reading kind of in conjunction with the stories, and they're quite similar, both books, though one is novel, the other is short stories.
Yeah.
They have a very similar feel and even a kind of similar construction. I was thinking about the short story called The Pool.
Oh, yeah.
Which is really about a place and the people who come into the place. Yeah. So tell us a little bit about Underhill. This is the village the village that Villager is all about.
Yeah, I mean, I've got quite a bit to say about The Pool as well, which actually is my favourite. I think it's arguably my favourite from Help the Witch. I think it's the one where I got closer to what I wanted to do. But yeah, Underhill's composite, I suppose, of lots of real Dartmoor villages like Chagford and South Brent and Buckfastleigh and Ashburton. The moor in so Underhill's a village on the edge of a West Country moor. The moor isn't Dartmoor, but it's exactly where Dartmoor is on the map. And any reference to a place outside this moor in Villager comes from the real world. So Newton Abbot, Torquay, these places get mentioned, but if it's the moor, you won't hear mention of any place that's actually on Dartmoor. Like the nearest one is Bovey Tracy, which is just over the edge of the moor, outside it. And there's a reason for this, and it's because, so in my books, my nonfiction, 21st Century Yokel, Ring the Hill, notebook, and also to an extent in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, which is like the last Cats and More book, I wrote about Dartmoor in those books. I wrote about the real Dartmoor and its folklore and its history and its people. And I thought, well, I've kind of done that. So I thought it would be a better, a more interesting challenge for myself in Villager to make up another moor with its own folklore, its own stories, its own people, its own places. So if anyone reads Villager and goes out looking, thinking this is Dartmoor, they're not going to find the exact places. But I do think as well, it's kind of it's got the ambience of Dartmoor. It's got that kind of mossy, damp feel. And I was living on Dartmoor when I wrote it as well, in two very damp houses.
Yeah, I think one of the houses in Villager, because it moves from building to building, the way the structure works, and time to time and character to character. There's a very, very damp cottage.
That had to get in there. I mean, that forced its way in there. I was living, so I say I've moved around so much, and what happened to me was I was living in Norfolk. I lived in Norfolk for 13 years. And then I was in the West Country for a while. I was in the Peak District for a while to write Help the Witch. I specifically moved to the Peak District in the harshest of winters, in The Beast from the East, to write Help the Witch, just as a kind of method writing thing. And then was back in the West Country, somehow ended up back in Norfolk. And that was the point where I knew that I just had to write Villager. It was kind of like I'd been putting it off for probably the best part of 20 years. It had been a very different book when I first conceived it. But I was in Norfolk and I thought, well, I can't do it here. It's a very Devon book. I need to move back to Devon. And I moved back at the height of lockdown, like 6 journeys during the height of lockdown from Norfolk to Devon, thinking I was going to get pulled over by the police. Finally got all my stuff there. And I didn't feel like I had a lot of choice in the place that I rented, but I knew the area where I'd seen this house and I thought that'll do. And this house, though, I'd lived like a mile and a half up the hill from it in a cabin about 2 or 3 years before. And I'd driven past this house. This is right on the edge of Dartmoor. And I'd just been looking at the windows and wondering what ghosts lived inside it, because it was a state. It was falling to bits. And then miraculously, it's renovated and it's up for rent. But it had been renovated so cheaply, like it was a real kind of like surface job. And there were some really, really bad things lurking behind that surface job in the walls. And I found this out as I lived there. I got there during lockdown, and it had this incredible walled garden that hadn't been touched for 10 years. It was totally overgrown. So I just went to town on the garden, did loads of work on it. And then I started to realize that all my clothes smelt all the time. It was so damp. There was just water like oozing out of the walls. And then and it just got worse and worse, because it turned out to be a very, very wet summer. And it had a septic tank that hadn't been touched for 20 years. And the landlords denied that there was even a septic tank there until it burst. And then I was basically standing in about a foot or two of water in my own kitchen, and it was just a nightmare. And I got really ill from the stress of it. The landlords refused to pay at first for all the repairs, and I got shingles. And I kind of
Oh,
thought,
this is all sounding familiar from
yeah,
Villager.
because of the chapter, yeah, Stopcock, the chapter of the book, and it was in a way. So there's two bits I think that are autobiographical in the book, because I think one of the great things with Villager for me was me stepping away from writing about myself, because I'd done it so much, and it was just amazing to pretend to be all these other people, and I was a bit tired of writing about myself. But I think the bits in it where I come in more are, so this chapter Stopcock, which is like a diary of this woman living in this damp flooded house on the edge of the moor. That there's a lot of me in that and my experience, although I thought it would be interesting to sort of change the gender and to make her a bit older and from a slightly different background. But there's a lot of me in that one. And the other autobiographical bit, people who read the book, when they start it, they'll straight away kind of go, who is this talking to me? There's a presence that's talking to them, and they suddenly realize it's not human. And they're kind of like, is this the moor? Is this a hill? And it's kind of like a hill on the edge of the moor that speaks. And I think that's the most autobiographical character in the book.
I was trying to figure out those are the sections entitled "Me Now," and
That's
it's
right,
a kind
yeah.
of eternal now, isn't it?
Yeah.
But there's also, I like the story about the message board, and all the villagers are just, has anyone seen my horse blanket? And and some of them are the kind of crabby ones who find fault with everything, and then there's the cadgers and scroungers.
Diana Wilson,
exactly.
She's the one who finds fault with just everything anyone says, and she really wasn't on there at all. Like, wasn't on any village message board I've been part of. She is totally fictional. But what
you have to say that.
Yes, yeah, I would have to say that anyway. But believe me, she is. But one of the most satisfying things about the feedback from people who've read this book is that she's turned into a slightly kind of iconic character. And a lot of people just picked up on her meanness, and they really love it. And I mean, she's such a minor character in the book. She's not very significant.
I like the older couple. There's the busybody who says, where's Sheila? Is Sheila all right? Still here. I'm fine. I can eat without dribbling.
Yeah.
I'm not decrepit.
but there are thousands of these, aren't there, all around the country? And there was a bit of inspiration from the message board I was on Dartmoor, but more so, I think, from my mum and dad's village message board, which is in Nottinghamshire. There's a story in there where someone says they're very concerned there's a black lad wandering around the village, and then someone is like, God, that's a bit racist, and then the guy who said it is like, black lab, and that was actually real. That actually happened.
that actually happened. Of course, I mean, a lot of the stories have this tinge of the weird and the supernatural, and the great thing is that there is somebody on this message board who is very strange indeed. And, we're just sort of left to ponder. But I loved the bit, Totnes, the ancient name of Totnes, comes from Totter, who was Totter, and then this entity says, "Oh, I knew Totter."
Yeah.
And you think, what is going on here?
Again, that's that thing of Totnes exists because the real world is just the same outside this moor. But yeah,
exactly.
Actually, I heard that Totnes, I think it comes from Tout Alles, which is all at ease. Which kind of sums up the character of the town. But actually, I found that in an old book, and then I've since realised it's not true, disappointingly.
Yeah, yeah. These things happened even before social media.
Yes. Yeah.
Stories
Oh,
just
without a
floating
doubt.
out there.
No fact checkers out there.
No, exactly. Well, the other story that I really, well, not story, section of Villager, there's a great section that is actually quite a lot about golf.
Yeah.
And when I read that, I did wonder whether you had also, clearly been a teenage golf fanatic, or he's not really a fanatic, is he? But he's keen on his golf.
Yeah, I mean, I've written about my adolescent golfing times, like to quite a large extent before. So it had to,
Mm,
for me to go back into that, it had to be something new for me. But there were elements of that feeling of being a teenage golf nut, but slightly
mm,
out of place in that universe. That I kind of transposed to Villager that I'd had as a teenager. I mean, I was very I loved books when I was a preteen. I was always kind of nagging my parents to read to me, and then when I was very young, and then just motoring through lots of different books. But then for some reason, around the time that I hit puberty, I stopped reading, and just I was just a sporty idiot for about 5 years. And golf was out of all these sports I played, golf was the one that kind of stuck. And it was sort of like an inverted form of rebellion for me against my parents, who were sort of working class and arty. And I got quite good at it, within
mm,
the context of like kids in Nottinghamshire. I got in the county team and things like that, but not so good that I could have genuinely made a living out of it. But I always felt a bit out of place in the universe, and I did write about that with these two kids who play golf, one of whom stops and becomes a kind of eco warrior,
mm.
which,
And the
which
other,
perhaps we could have done.
you were talking about writing about music, and I should say as well, on Twitter, you seem to have a huge collection of vinyl that you seem to be disposing of one way or another.
There's still too much, even though a lot's gone, but there's still too much.
And again, it is the kind of velvet bell bottom type of music. I'm disappointed that you're not wearing a paisley headband or anything like that today. But can you talk a little bit about the soundtrack? I was listening to that earlier on.
Oh,
How
yes.
did the soundtrack to Villager come about?
Well, there was actually a soundtrack to Help the Witch as well.
Oh,
So,
right. Okay.
because there are 10 stories in Help the Witch, and I talked to some musicians, and I kind of asked them if they fancied doing anything with any of those stories. So what it turned out to be was 10 songs very loosely inspired by each story in Help the Witch by 10 different artists. And it worked really well. And it was a really exciting feeling, actually, to sort of have someone kind of create art from your art, really, and really take it and run with it. I said to each band, I said, just really take it as a loose starting point. Do what the hell you want. And they were all so diverse. I mean, I suppose you'd call them vaguely folk, all of them, but really within the folk genre, just so eclectic. And then I kind of thought, well, I'd love it if every one of my books, certainly my fiction, had soundtracks. So I had that in my mind as I'm writing Villager, and I'm thinking maybe there's the potential of doing the same sort of thing, because there are lots of bands mentioned in it, fictional bands and a few real ones. But a lot of the book, what kind of, in a way, what holds the book together is this lost album from 1968 called Wallflower by R.J. McKendry. R.J. McKendry's a songwriter who's come from California to Devon, and he's a bit lost. He was in a kind of semi-successful garage pop band in the mid 60s, and the legend is he almost joined the Byrds at one point, and then he's turned up in Devon and he's drifting around. He doesn't know anyone, and he ends up making this record that's inspired by the landscape of the moor in Villager and the landscape beyond that to an extent. And he records it at a kind of hippie arts college, which is loosely based on Dartington. And then the record gets lost for years, as so many great records that were recorded in the late 60s did. You know, it was almost like there were so many great records coming out in the late 60s, early 70s. There wasn't enough room for all of them to have the success they deserved. So, and eventually their record collectors started getting hold of this album and learning about the legend of it, and it gradually went up in price over the years. And by the turn of the millennium, it's a record that's worth over £1,000. And but I heard it all the way through. I heard this record in my head and knew exactly what it sounded like.
This character is completely made up, right?
Utterly made up, yeah.
Okay.
And I mean, I've kind of taken some elements of musicians I love. He's sort of, I suppose he's loosely affiliated with a kind of with a Pentangle type band, a Pentangle or Fairport or Incredible String Band type group. He becomes loosely affiliated with them later, but he's more a sort of I'm going to say Circus Maximus. He could have been in Circus Maximus, who not many people have heard. They're a Texan psych band from the mid 60s. Buy both their records because they're incredible. And then, but he's more, I'm thinking he's more along the lines of primitivist psychedelic folk like Sandy Bull or Robbie Basho. And then, but I was hearing all this stuff in my head I think one of the things that happened to me as I was writing this book, and this is probably what makes it different from other books I've written, is just how much I believed as I was writing it, how much I believed in the characters and how I'd get really upset when something bad happened to them. And I just felt like I was being pulled along. And this is actually, just going off the point a bit, this is actually the reason that I couldn't write this book when I was younger, because I would invent characters and I didn't believe in them. They just didn't seem real to me. Whereas when I was writing this a year or two ago, it just felt so real, including R.J. McKendry, including his music. So I got to the end of the book and I was still thinking maybe there's something to be done where you have a compilation which is sort of like one person being R.J. McKendry and doing like 2 or 3 songs, and then some of the other bands around him that I've made up, some people being those bands. But I've got this friend called Will Twynham who records under the name Dimorphodons. He's an incredibly talented musician. He's really obsessed with 60s music, 60s equipment as well, 60s recording techniques, but in a really futuristic way. Like he's not interested in doing a pastiche of the past. It's like he's interested in the way that the 60s were really forward-looking time for music. And he read the first draft of the book and he said, I want to make this album. I want to make the whole thing. I want to be R.J. McKendry. And it all just clicked into place because I looked at him. I've known him for kind of 15 years. And without me thinking this while I'm writing it, my fictional portrait of R.J. McKendry, kind of tall, slightly nerdy, slightly shy genius, that's my friend Will, really. So he's the perfect person to do it. And he's in his mid-40s now, but he looks about 25. So we did the photo shoot for the album, and he can be passed off as a kind of Californian who was sort of 23 in 1968. And he made. So he lives on the Essex-Hertfordshire border, and he came over to his manager's house, which is in the highest village in Dorset, Ashmore, up on Cranbourne Chase. He stayed in a tent, still COVID time, and he stayed in a tent. And he almost got blown away while he was staying in this tent, and he recorded the whole album there, including one magical night when we went up. I think it was Melbury Hill or Melbury Beacon we went up to and recorded the last bit as the sun went down by the trig point. I even played a tiny bit of crap guitar on one of the tracks, and he was just, and then I heard it and I was like, this is pretty much the record I heard in my head. How on earth has he done this? How has he made it? Because I kept it loose. I didn't give him that many lyrics. I gave him track titles and I gave him a flavor, but he really understood it. And we put it out on vinyl. We did a really limited pressing of it when the book came out, and it sold out within like 3 days. So we've had to repress it. It's actually coming out again in a couple of weeks.
I was definitely getting I would say an incredible string band vibe.
Yeah.
But you're right. There is a modernity about it as well. You know, it doesn't just sound like a pastiche. It's very genuinely new music. It's its own thing. It's not pretending to be something else.
It's a difficult one, and it's something I've thought about quite a lot. Like, can you make a record that sounds totally 1968? Because obviously you can maybe use analog equipment, and you can try to get that flavor, that feeling. But as a person who has lived through the last 50 odd years, or some of the last 50 odd years, you are inevitably going to absorb some stuff. You're going to absorb hip hop. You're going to absorb techno, maybe, even if you're not into it. And it's maybe going to creep in just really subtle ways that make it impossible to completely recreate that thing. Will actually disagrees, because Will's so stubbornly like such a kind of 60s person. He reckons no, I've not absorbed any of that stuff. But I think that you do, even if you're trying not to.
Did you write any of the lyrics or oversee things in any way, or did you just let him do his thing?
There's very few. There's just a couple on the other tracks, but the one that I did actually properly write the lyrics for is this song called Little Meg, which is a supposedly ancient folk song from the moor, from Devon, but I totally made it up, and it pops up a lot in the book, and it's connected with this Meg or Megan character, who's in another character who kind of holds the book together, really, because and this goes back, this is the book set, it's almost 200 years of history, and she's kind of there somewhere in every part of that. But that was in a way, Little Meg was a version of Widdicombe Fair, the old Dartmoor folk song, and that inspired another little story in the book, which is Widdicombe Fair it's a very trad kind of song, and they still have the Widdicombe Fair on Dartmoor at the end of every summer. I actually went to it last year, and it's been done in some really kind of quite boring ways, but the Nashville teens, who aren't from Nashville, they're from Surrey, they did a version of it in the late 60s, and it's amazing. It's fuzzy but slightly funky and dirty, and it's almost like a completely different song. In fact, they did 2 versions, and the fuzzier, funkier version only came out in Hungary during communism. It's the most surreal thing. It's the most I've ever paid for a single. I think I paid like 40 quid for the single, but it's now it's like 100 and something. So the RJ McKendry Little Meg, there's 2 versions of it, and one is me thinking of the Hungarian version of this Nashville Teens song, and there's a weird Devon connection with the Nashville Teens, and that was a really significant song while I was writing the book. I listened to that a lot.
Did you ever want to be a musician yourself?
I did. It's a bit silly, really, because when I quit golf and I started going to like gigs and things, like catching up really quickly, trying to learn absolutely loads about music, I immediately picked up my friend's guitar, and he taught me the bass line to Debaser by the Pixies, and we formed a band, which I kind of yelled in, a really crap punk band, and we never played a gig because the one time we were going to play a gig, the college refectory flooded, and then I got a girlfriend and I quit the band, and I never fully learned guitar. But I also thought, this is so ridiculous. I think I was probably just about to turn 18 at that point, and I thought, oh, it's too late for me now. It's too late for me to be in a good band, and there's no point actually learning a musical instrument unless you're going to be a rock star, is there? So stupid. Like not that thought of, well, maybe you could just play guitar because it's relaxing and nice. So I actually started learning a bit again recently, but I haven't got very far.
And then the other thing that comes across very strongly, again on Twitter, and really from the look of your books, is the visuals and the art,
Yeah.
which I think is sensational. I love the look of the cover. There's a little map of the village in here as well. But I gather that's all a family affair.
Not
visuals.
Completely, but it is to an extent. It is a really, really satisfying thing to just to have books that are totally what you want them to be, like from right the way through the covers as well. Because I haven't had that in the past, to be honest. Like when the early part of my career, and that's one of the really nice things about publishing with Unbound. They understand what you need on the cover, a cover that really suits what's inside. The covers for my books, they've been done by two artists. The Nonfiction was done by Claire Malinsky, so Ring the Hill, 21st Century Yokel, and Notebook, they're all hers. And then the fiction, Help the Witch and Villager, are both by Joe McLaren. But the illustrations inside are by my parents. And this was Notebook and Villager have been total family collaborations. So my mum's actually done lino prints for all of the last 5 books, starting with 21st Century Yokel. She did 2 for each chapter. And then in Notebook, my dad did some sketches as well as my mum's lino prints. And then for Villager, my mum did the lino prints again. And my dad did the map of the village because he's very into drawing maps at the moment.
He also he did pictures that involved a family cat, I seem to recall. I mean, not as part of your books. This is just a little project of his own, but very sweet.
It's absolutely amazing what he's done with it and how many he's done. To say, like, it's not been published or anything. He did some postcards of it. I love him to do it as a book. And it was his therapy, really, because he's got this cat that I sort of fobbed off onto my parents, who is called, she used to be called Clifton, and then she became Clifton Bridget, and now she's Bridget. And she went to live with my mum and dad because she used to beat the shit out of she used to get the shit beaten out of her by my other female cat, Roscoe. And so I realized can't live together. My parents took her in, but she's a bit of a kind of wild thing. She wanders a long way, and in summer she just goes missing and causes my mum and dad all sorts of stress and heartache. She's been gone for 6 weeks before.
Wow.
And she crosses this huge busy road when she goes missing, where their previous cat got run over a few years ago. So it's really upsetting for them. And once when she was away, my dad, because he was so obsessing over what had happened to her, looking for her constantly, he just went to his workroom and he started doing these paintings of her adventures, imagining where she was. So she became Bridget the time traveling cat, and she'd be on Abbey Road with the Beatles and because my dad's such a lover of art, she'd appear in lots of paintings, like a Bruegel, Hunters in the Snow, with a mouse in her mouth, and all those things. And then she finally came back, and he stopped. But I think he'd done about 30 by the time that she came back.
Does he sell them? I mean, they're just irresistible. I love them when you put them up on Twitter.
He has sold a few originals. He's got one of those big Cartel pages, and I've put them on. Yeah, when I've put them on Twitter, people always ask, and I keep saying you should do a book, and he's like, oh, I can't be bothered. I really, hopefully he will at some point, because they are special. I look at them and I'm kind of like, the amount of detail and thought that's gone into them. But he's always painted. He's my whole life. My loads of memories of him when I was a kid, just sitting there painting various Derbyshire landscapes, and me bringing him a succession of instant coffees that he'd ignore because he was so into the painting. There'd be like five cold instant coffees on his desk next to him.
And is your mum a professional artist?
She's not. I mean, she's just about, after way over 10 years of doing it, like got to the point where she will actually say artist, like on her Instagram profile. But she's so modest, about infuriatingly modest, really, about everything she does. But she's got so good with her lino prints, and I often feel that people are more interested in her lino prints than my writing, really, a lot of the time with the books. I think there's certain ones, that particularly the ones she did of my cat the bear, who was my sad cat. Those, I mean, she did limited runs of them, but if she'd done a lot of them, they would all have gone. People just constantly nag her to do them again. And there's a hare from my book Ring the Hill. It's a hare which has, it's a liner print of a hare with flowers, in various wildflowers inside the hare's body, and people really want that one all the time, and people are always saying, can I make it into a tattoo?
Have you got collections of these on the walls? I suppose you're such a nomad, maybe you don't put art on the walls.
This is what people who know me, they always can't believe how many times I've moved, because I don't travel light. And every single time it's probably not a great way to do it, really, in terms of how much it exhausts you. But every single time I put everything on the wall, I act like I'm staying in a place for 10 or 15 years. So my house is full of like abstract art and bits of my mum's art and old film and music posters. And I should have actually done this interview in a different room, because there's a particular piece of art that inspired the piece of art that I wrote about in Villager, an abstract painting that I found.
Oh yes, this is Joyce. Joyce is the painter, and I is her painting also the cover of the album?
It is, yeah.
Such attention to detail here. It's amazing.
Well spotted on that one. That's like, because again, it was this. That's another example of me just completely making up a piece of art, and then it exists, like just like the album, because my mum painted it after I described it. And it's really the start of the book. It starts with this painting. It's another. There's a lot of stuff in the book that's about art being ignored at the time, not being quite in tune with its own time, and or almost being too good for its own time. And then gradually, as it gathers dust, people become more interested in it. It's almost like the piece of art or the piece of music changes with time. And I've noticed this about so many things that I love. I think they are that kind of thing: books, music, records, pieces of art. And so this painting, it's like a painting of the village and of the hill behind the village. And I tried to describe what I thought it would look like. And then I said to my mum, can you paint this? And she's like, oh, I don't know about that. I don't know if it'll be any good. And you're asking a lot of me there. And I'm like, all right, don't worry. Don't do it, because it's too much for you. And then like a week later, there it is, absolutely perfect. And it becomes the album cover for Wallflower. So that's another.
It does look like a 60s album cover as well, doesn't it? So the idea is that Joyce is painting this is it sort of in the 60s or late 50s or something, and then it becomes the cover to a psychedelic album, and it just looks absolutely perfectly right. The colours and everything.
I think it worked. And she was, in her typically modest way, she said, just tell them not to use it on the album. Tell them not to use it. I don't mind if they use something else, but loads of people love it, and it's up on my wall as well. The original's up on my wall in the kitchen.
What were your influences for fiction? We've talked a little bit about folklore. Are there any other fiction writers or writers of the West Country that you've been inspired by?
Well, less so in a way writers of the West Country, and in a way less so writers from the UK. I think the weird thing with me is people probably think of me as quite an English sort of writer in a way, just because I write about the landscape so much, and I do write about the folklore, and I've read a lot of folklore books. But actually, my reading habits, I would say for a start, they're probably like 80% fiction is what I read, and I would say probably 70% of that is American, and they're the books I really love. They're the books that I've always read, even at the point where I just was not good enough or experienced enough to write my own novel. I'd be going, oh God, I want to do something like this. And it'd be reading people like Annie Proulx or Alice Munro or John Irving earlier on, I suppose. I'm less keen on John Irving's more recent books, but I loved him for a while. Richard Russo. I was going to say Garrison Keillor, but actually I'm not. I like a bit of Garrison Keillor, but just I was just kind of like, well, why can't people write about small town British life in this warm, detailed, character driven way that Americans do it, like about small towns there? So it's almost like a sort of, I suppose it's a hidden influence for me, but that's the stuff that I really, really love. I would say I don't think I could list my 10 favorite novels off the top of my head, but if I did, I reckon 8 of them would be American.
And what about things like ghost stories and folk horror?
Oh, yeah, of course. I mean, I went through a big M.R. James phase when I was living in Norfolk, and when I was first starting to think about nonfiction I could write that was about walking and the landscape. I remember I had M.R. James audiobook just as a constant companion on winter walks in Suffolk, those flatlands in the mist, and that I love that stuff. But I'm not into horror at all. I'm into kind of like gently creepy stuff, unsettling stuff. Weird thing is, Help the Witch won a Shirley Jackson horror writing award, and I'm kind of like, I can't write horror. I don't want to spend that amount of time in that place because I'm too much of a wimp, really.
And it's not a full-on horror story. It's sort of unsettling.
Yeah.
But it's mostly atmosphere, isn't it?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I kind of think of Help the Witch as a book of ghost stories where you're not entirely sure if the ghost is just the landscape.
And there are elements of that in Villager as well. But I think it's very much to do with what you. A big theme of yours is time, the passage of time, the melancholia of the passage of time, and nostalgia. I mean, that's your sort of, seems to be your great thread, and that can, the past can haunt people. That is a very potent ghost, the past.
Yeah, and I think the book that I've started writing, the follow-up to Villager, I that's there as well in a very different way. That's definitely, a lot of that's about the passage of time, although it's set in a very different, it's got a more linear storyline. It's called 1983, and it's set actually in a mining village in Nottinghamshire. And so very, very different kind of setting and time, but it does come up. I'm always just thinking about how time changes things, how time changes objects, and people. I think about it more and more the older I get. God knows how much I'm going to be thinking about it when I'm in my 60s or 70s.
Yeah, people dig things up and find things in the walls and ruminate about what has gone on in the past, and it's such a strong flavour of the book. And even in the golfing story, it's related sometime in the future. This kid is sort of looking back. And
he's
and
writing
thinking,
as a middle-aged man looking back to his teenage self. Yeah.
And there's a great, I think it's in that story, there's or section, there's a great line that is about that the greatest 24 hours of your life, you don't necessarily know that you're living it while you're living it. And that's a good thing, because if you were to go, this is going to be the greatest 24 hours of my life, it would be incredibly depressing.
It really would. I mean, there's no surprise here that one of my favorite films is Dazed and Confused. Have you seen Dazed and Confused?
What's it about? I don't think I have.
It came out in, I think I'm right in saying 1993, and it was about one night in the life of some teenagers in Austin, Texas in 1976. And it was just clearly one of those nights that all of them would remember for the rest of their life. But at the time, they don't think it's anything remarkable. And they're just going out and drinking and listening to music, and it's the last day of school, and there's just nothing happens. It's a hangout film, but there's a particular line in that. I mean, you just get this really strong sense that they don't know how good they've got it at the time. And but there's a particular line which is kind of like, and it's something like, if somebody tells me these, if somebody were to tell me these are the best days of my life, I might as well kill myself right now. And the guys, you're kind of like, oh, you spoiled git. You don't realize you've just got it so good right now. And so, and I like that idea, and I think about that film quite a lot as well, because that's a double nostalgia now to that film, because it came out in 1993, but it's a very 1993 idea of the 70s. And if it's only 17 years in the future, whereas now it's like 1993, 30 years from Dazed and Confused. So it's almost like that other nostalgia is there. And I'm constantly thinking about these things, and it's like the hairstyles aren't quite right. They're almost like a 70s mixed with a bit of sort of late grunge era.
Well, then it's back to your idea that things can't help seeping through. You could never, truly go back and make something absolutely authentic.
It'd be a completely different film if they made it now. Just as, like, if I'd written Villager in when I wanted to first write it, it would have been a completely different book. Probably completely crap, actually. It would have been set in Norfolk for a start.
Very flat Norfolk.
Yes,
you wouldn't have had a hill, I suppose.
So hillock, maybe.
Yeah. The experience of publishing with Unbound. I noticed at the back of the book you've got all the subscribers.
Yeah.
And there seem to be masses and masses and masses of them. Is that generally what Unbound needs, or have you just got loads and loads of fans?
No, it's really what you need. It's kind of the only way to do it. And it was a big risk me doing it for the first time. I mean, it's 5 books now, well, 6 actually, if you count the one that's already funded, the follow-up. And I did it at a big turning point in my writing career, which was 2015, 2016. 2015, I started writing my first Unbound book, which was 21st Century Yokel. And that was where I kind of said, all right, I'm going to completely ignore what a lot of publishers have told me about this won't work. You need something which has more of a hook or a journey or an angle. It needs to be more brandable and marketable. And I thought, I'm not listening to that. I've listened to that for years. I'm just writing exactly the book I want to write, which is going to be a mixture of social history, family history, music, landscape, folklore, all nature, all rolled into one. And I'm just going to try and make it what I feel like it needs to be. And I wrote 90% of the book without knowing if I'm going to find a publisher for it. To be honest, my agent at the time was sort of like, I think you really need to shape this more, which really, like, a lot of the nature writing books at that time that were being commissioned, they want this human element, which is kind of like someone's sad at the start of the book, and then they meet an otter, and then by the end
a
of
hawk.
yes, by the end of the book, they're kind of like, oh, and everything's all right now. But, you know, I like a lot of those books. I really like them, and they're really powerful, but it wasn't my true story. It wasn't the right story for me. And I didn't want to be pushed towards that. And so instead of sending it to traditional publishers, I decided to do it with Unbound. And I mean, I was lucky because I built up an online readership through my 21st century yokel columns for The Guardian, where I was writing about various things in the countryside, and with the help of the bear as well, because by people who'd read about the bear in the books about the cats and more, it was like a sort of back door that they could come into to the nature stuff. And not all of them were interested in the nature stuff or walking or landscape, but some of them were, and they stayed, and they were there, and they helped fund that book. And I didn't know for sure it was going to fund. A lot of books from Unbound don't fund, but it funded in 7 hours, and it sort of set their record. And I kind of went, oh, well, maybe this will work. So I've continued with it, and I do have. I feel like I'm really niche in what I do. And I feel, you know, in the grand scheme of things, it's quite small. It's quite small readership. You know, I don't get foreign rights on my recent books. I haven't really got a lot of there's people in America buy them a little bit, and people buy them on import. I have got overseas readerships, but I don't have a vast readership, but I just feel that people have been really loyal to me over the last few years with these books, and that's been absolutely amazing. And that's meant that I know that I can fund a book. And it's also kept me doing it when I think maybe it could be argued that, like, since Villager, I'm in more of a, particularly since Villager, I'm in a position where maybe I could go back to writing for a traditional publisher and be able to do more my own thing. But I like the way things are going. I really love these covers that Unbound put on the book, and I love the way readers get involved as well. And they're really chuffed to be involved. They're chuffed to have a character named after them, like Diana Wilson, the mean one on the message board. She's a real person. She's a pledge for a named character. So I don't know what she's like in real life. I hope she's all right with it.
I suppose it's quite fun to do that and then make them a slightly mean person.
I think the temptation's just to make everyone who's pledged a lovely character, but I just thought I'd go against that, and I hope she appreciated it.
I can't remember who the writer was, but somebody murdered the, not real life, obviously. In the book, the character that was given the name of a real person was the character that got horribly murdered, so they weren't in it very long.
Oh dear.
So I think you can have a bit of
I think if I'd done that, I'd be pretty chuffed to be murdered.
And Unbound, once it's all go, you've got all your pledges and subscriptions. I mean, you get a proper editing, you get an editor and a designer and all of that. It's proper publishing, you know.
It really is. I feel I've actually been more lightly edited sometimes in my traditional publishing experiences before. There was one, the Villager wasn't edited that heavily, but there was one quite large suggestion that the publisher, Matthew Clayton, Unbound, he made to me. And as soon as he said it, I was like, that is just so right. You were absolutely on it there. And it was just one tweak, and it made everything come together really well. And I really believe in editing. Like, I won't mention him, but is by name, but there was a very famous writer I interviewed once for The Observer who told me, I don't need editing at this point in my career. I know what I'm doing. I don't need anything anyone to touch what I'm doing. And he's very good, but I don't think that's ever going to be quite true, no matter how experienced you are. And I think one of the pivotal points in my career was a really harsh editor who worked on my second golf book called Tristan Jones, who worked for Yellow Jersey, and he almost made me cry because he was so harsh with me. And I came out of that a writer who was more hard on himself, and so he made me a better writer, really. And so that editing is it's an unappreciated art, really, I think.
So it sounds like the next one is already written, all good to go.
I'm a bit frustrated at the moment because I wrote a big chunk of it, and then because the Villager paperbacks come out, obviously, and I think perhaps this is one of the downsides of being with a smaller publisher. You have to perhaps do a bit more online to get it out there, and I've been doing events and stuff, and I kind of thought I could carry on with the momentum while that's been going, but I've been a bit sidetracked recently, just doing that, just getting it safely out into the world, because part of me wants to just say, right, well, the work's done, go and fend for yourself to the book now, let's find out how you do on your own. But you end up wanting to sort of chaperone it out into the world a bit, and you have to do that. So that's, for me, over the last few weeks, that's kind of, because I do podcasting and I do Substack writing as well, I can't do it all. So it's kind of been on hold, but I think I'm getting to the point where I'm going to go back in, and I'm really, really excited about being able to vanish into another fictional world, really.
If it was your choice, would you ideally just like to sit at home and write and not have to do all the heavy lifting of promotion?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I find myself kind of sort of putting the life of writers from a pre-social media age on a bit of a pedestal, which is probably unrealistic, because I'm thinking you've got your readership, books sell a bit more at that time, generally. You just go away and you be a recluse and you bury yourself in this project. And I want that so much a lot of the time. But I also, and then I get a bit jaded with because I don't want to self-promote. I really don't want to self-promote at all. I just want to write. Ideally, part of the time I fantasize about just writing a book and leaving it in a cave, hoping someone finds it in 40 years. But I've got to pay the rent, so you've got to do these things. And also, when I get into that phase where I tend to resent the expectation that's put on you to do so much promotion, I forget that some of it is very, very nice. Like going to an event and getting feedback about your book, meeting the people who've read the book and everything. That's so lovely. And it's actually really different to the social media version of it. Like I did that the other night in Stroud, and it's fantastic, and it makes it feel real, because you're doing it. I do it for, I think 100% primary reason is it's the process. It's when you're in it. It's when you're creating these things more and more. That's the reason you're doing it. But it's not. You'd be kidding yourself if it's the only reason. You do want people to enjoy it. You get pleasure from seeing people enjoying it.
Yes, I hope a lot of the festivals come back after the awful years of the pandemic.
Yeah.
But things like, Port Elliot was an absolutely great festival. Latitude, places like that.
Times. Yeah. It does seem like they're getting going again. I feel like, I've been asked to do a couple. There's a new Devon one called the Byline Festival, which I'm doing later this year, and I'm doing Red Roof Book Festival on Sunday. yeah, it feels like we're past that period now, doesn't it?
Yeah, things are sort of getting up and running again. But what I loved about Port Elliot, which definitely has finished, was that
Yeah,
you got, I mean, the events were just so different. It wasn't like a bookshop event. It was much more, I think, because people wander in and wander out and wander in and wander out, and it's not a sort of sit down, pay attention for an hour.
yeah.
You've kind of got to keep it lively, and it was always a lot of fun. And then the nice thing was you could see people drift by and they'd think that sounds interesting, and then they'd come into your tent, and
There was a
that
lot
was
of
the
choice.
game, wasn't it? Get people in.
It was, yeah, and it was, yeah, there was a lot of choice there. I particularly enjoyed the Ways with Weirds stage, right at the end near the viaduct, which
Oh,
was
right.
run by two funeral directors.
Yeah, I mean, you could just find the weirdest things, couldn't you, just by wandering around,
Absolutely, yeah.
So I hope something like that comes back again.
End of the Road feels a little bit like that still. I did End of the Road last year, and that was really good fun.
Where is that?
That's in Dorset. It's at
Uh,
Lormitory Gardens on Cranbourne Chase. It's actually, weirdly, it's about 2 miles from where the Wallflower album was recorded. So it was a perfect place to do a talk, really. But that feels unusual. It feels small as well.
Yeah, that's another thing about festivals. They can get sort of too big for their boots in a way, or
Absolutely,
unmanageable. Less easy to manage. There's a perfect size, I think, for a festival.
definitely.
Anyway, so I'm glad the next one is on the way. So is this short stories, novel, or this kind of interesting blend that you have?
And no, it's very much a novel. This one, it's actually it's much, in some ways. I was going to say, I started it and I thought it's going to be way more straightforward, almost more mainstream than Villager is, and then but it's stopped being that. It's starting to get much weirder, but it is linear. That is the one thing, and it all takes place in 1983, which is a year that I've become a little bit fascinated by, politically, and also what it was for me as a kid. And I turned 8 in 1983, and I suppose I've just been thinking more about where I come from and what made me who I am, and the unusual things about my childhood that you think are just commonplace, but actually make you a bit odd in some ways, and influence my writing now. And so it's really the character, the main character, the kid in it. There's an awful lot of me in this character, but he's different in the sense that I didn't meet any aliens when I was eight. Or maybe I did, who knows?
Yeah, not that you know of. But I'm just sort of thinking 1983 musically, I'm not sure. Not a lot of psychedelia going on, not much folk going on. How are you
No,
handling?
no, I wouldn't say it's definitely not the center of my musical taste, 1983. But I was nuts about music in 1983. I bought Smash Hits when I was 8. I was like a subscriber to Smash Hits. I was really, really crazy about music. I taped the top 40 religiously because I had a kind of guru who was my mum and dad's friend's kid, Jane Hampshire, who she was like 2.5, 3 years older than me. So she knew everything about music. And she just told me, she was like, you've got to get Dare by the Human League or Lexicon of Love by ABC. And she was right every time. They're great records. I think the thing is with me, people, and it's probably something to do with some of the stuff I put on Twitter as well. That thing where Twitter's only ever like an angle of someone, isn't it? It's one aspect.
Yeah,
And people think I walk around in a cape only listening to acid folk, when in reality, I listen to Prince as well, and I often dress in a very, what do you call it, normcore, as my partner calls it sometimes, which I just think, doesn't that just mean normal? I dress like that a lot of the time, and people, I dress in various different ways, and I do really, really lionize the music of the late 60s, but I like all sorts of stuff, really, and I want to write about all sorts of stuff. I tend not to be. I'm very restless in my interests overall.
I'll have to think of you in your normcore rather than dressing every day like Jimi Hendrix. So I'll have to put that idea.
I
to
had my
bed.
hair cut 3 days ago. You see, it could have been all different.
Oh yeah. It normally is a bit wilder. So
A bit wide, yes.
I am going to wind up with 3 questions that I ask everybody who joins me in the book bag. So, do you have a favourite artwork?
I've got it here.
Oh.
It's The Wildflowers of Chalk and Limestone. It's the New Naturalist from, I'm guessing this came out 1950.
Right, okay.
I'm just kind of obsessed with the art that Clifford and Rosemary Ellis did for the New Naturalist books, which ran from, I think it was late 40s until the early 80s when Clifford died. And they're all so beautiful. I think I've got like 40 or 50 of them on my shelf, and they're quite hard to find these days. Like, I've picked them up in charity shops and stuff, but a lot of the time you're paying like 30, 40 quid if you go to a secondhand bookshop, and they're getting more and more rare, and they're just consistently beautiful. I just particularly like this one because it's got the white horse, and then I'm guessing this is Red Campion just here, and then they stopped because Clifford died and Rosemary decided not to carry on her own, and they restarted them. Collins published them, but they are still pretty, but then they don't have that same thing. But I mean, I'm a bit pretentious in having all those because I'm not going to read them. They're very, very scientific. I'm not going to spend like a week reading loads of scientific stuff about British thrushes, for example. but I do. But I have also like dipped into some of them. They have become useful. Like the Dartmoor one is really, really good, and the Peak District one, and then there's one called The Folklore of Birds, which I actually paid 80 quid for. And I should grab that as well. That's really, really good and really beautiful. It's got a spooky owl on the cover.
And who doesn't love a spooky owl?
Exactly. That's why one had to appear in Help the Witch.
Of course. And so my next question, do you have a book that you have failed to read unaccountably and you're a bit embarrassed by this failure, or a book that you pretend that you've read and you never have?
Well, I don't think there must have been a time in my life where I pretended to read books, like I think most of us might have done that in my early 20s. Something I'd actually read 2 chapters of, I'd say I'd read it. I'm pretty sure there were those. I don't think I do that anymore, and I also don't beat myself up in the way that I used to about not having read classics. I mean, I had a bit of an odd education, really. I've not got A-level or degrees, and I just sort of I kind of read what I wanted to read. I didn't have too much pressure to sort of tick all the boxes. I have kind of only in more recent years started to read Dickens and Hardy, for example, and there's just loads of huge gaps in my knowledge. My reading, a lot of it's more kind of obscure mid-20th century stuff. I spent more time reading that than reading kind of big classics. I only read my first Kafka book like 4 weeks ago. So there's not stuff I'm beating myself up. There's not a lot of classics I'm beating myself up for not reading, but there are a few. And weirdly, when you mentioned this question today, I was just about to start The Grapes of Wrath on audiobook, and I'm embarrassed that I've never read that. I'm really embarrassed because I love Steinbeck and I've read like 4 other Steinbecks, but I've not read that, the one that everyone talks about. And I know it's going to be great, because I particularly loved East of Eden, but I'm trying to find the right mood for it, and because I think it's going to be very, very sad.
Yeah. Yes, it's definitely something I'm not in a hurry to read for that.
Really?
For that reason, I think mood is a very good reason for staying away from a book.
Yeah.
I mean, I found during lockdown, and also this worked for music as well. I really, I mean, I couldn't listen to something like Joy Division, and I love
Yeah.
Joy Division, but there were things that just like, no, it's too grim at the moment. This is not the time for that.
I listened to a lot of disco during lockdown.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Exactly. Something more upbeat. So,
yeah.
Okay. And the last question: what's the weirdest or funniest, or maybe rudest thing anybody's ever given you in terms of feedback about your work?
Well, when you said this, what I realized is that I must have a really good editing facility in my brain, because I feel like over the years on social media, there must have been so many of these, but now I just can't think of any. Like where you're kind of going, did you really read my book, or do you think I do this? With a lot of, actually, that did happen quite a lot when I was writing the cat books. What was utterly frustrating, because the people who'd read them knew what they were, but then there were so many assumptions, because people think of a certain thing when they think of cat books. They think of a very syrupy sort of, I mean, they can't imagine that a cat book could be decently written in any way. And I understand that, because I sort of feel I have that preconception. But when My Sad Cat became fairly successful on Twitter, when he got to like 300,000 followers, you could see this stuff bouncing into your timeline where people were assuming it was kind of like Marley and Me, or Dewey the Library Cat or something. It was one of those sort of, and actually, the books would have sold loads more if they had been, but because I was kind of writing about lots of other things at the same time and trying to make them a bit different. So that was frustrating, but that's more like a just a general thing. And the other one that I thought of was when I was writing my early days writing nonfiction. So one of the 2 music books that I'm very, very harsh on that I wrote in my 20s was called Educating Peter, and the other one's called Lost Tribes of Pop. I don't think that's quite as bad, but Educating Peter, I wrote it for all the wrong reasons. My heart wasn't in it. I wrote it because it sounded sexy as a sales pitch. It's actually the biggest advance I've ever got for a book, compared to what you get now. It's just what you get now is just piddling. It wasn't that much, but it was because it was a very marketable idea. But the actual book itself, these are the exact books I don't want to write now. The books that sound great on a pitch, but are actually shit. And I want to write the books that if you try to summarize them, they're like marketing departments would go, what? I'm not going to touch that. But then they're actually quite good. A lot of my favorite books are like that, like Rings of Saturn by W.G. Siebold. You can't really sum them up very easily, certainly not in a sexy way. But this was because it was me as an ex-music journalist taking the son of my parents' friends around Britain, who was a new metal musician of 15 in a new metal band who wanted to be a rock star, taking him around Britain to meet musicians to show him that he didn't want to be a rock star, showing him all the negative sides. And it was a disaster. Like, he didn't turn up for a lot of the time. And it was, and the book has like one tiny okay bit in it. But then I had a big publisher, and I did a lot of radio interviews. And I remember getting halfway through this radio interview and realizing that the guy thought it was fiction, the guy who was interviewing me. And I was utterly horrified by this. And I think this is a measure of how I view fiction as the ultimate art form, because my reaction was, fucking hell, it would have been a lot better than that if it was fiction. It would have made something exciting happen. But all of these interviews that I did, for some reason, the promotion for that book was just an out and out nightmare. I did. There was another interview where the radio guy just kept saying, like, so would you say this book is like that film Road Trip? And I was like, no, it's nothing like that. And then he'd ask me the same question again. And this is a fairly forgotten film. It's one of those post-American Pie kind of buddy films. And then I had to do an interview for the Evening Standard. No, I wrote a piece for the Evening Standard, which was, I don't know if you're going to want to leave this in, but it was one of the most unpleasant editing experiences that I've ever had. It was like a piece on trial parenting that they cooked up as a kind of way to promote the book. And I had to pose with a model, a teenager who was a model, who wasn't even in the book, wasn't even the teenager in the book. They got a model for me and we had to look like we'd fallen out on a bench, like staring away from each other, looking miserable. And then I got all these really strange editing inquiries, just like which had nothing to do with the piece, such as like, when you first saw your wife, did you imagine her pregnant instantly? Can you put that in the piece? And it's like, I'm not even writing about that. It was just that was really, I mean, I should have, if I was being true to myself, that would have been the point where I kind of walked away from that kind of writing and did something utterly weird and niche and more true to myself. But that influenced, that experience with that book really influenced that decision. And at that time I did want to write fiction. The guy was, I was amazed that the guy had got that from this book. He'd thought that I was just writing about a main character called Tom, who just happened to be called Tom, who'd done these things. But
maybe you invented autofiction, Tom, all those years ago.
I'm sure someone had done that before, hadn't they? There must have been someone who'd done it. Didn't Paul Auster do it in the 70s or 80s?
Oh, yes. Well, people turned up. I mean, I know Amos did it as well, didn't he? He turned up in as a character in one of his novels. So
you see, I do it now. I've thought about with my new one, making the main character have my name, but making it all very different. I do it now, but the point was that book felt so shackled within the sort of those slightly journalistic books that are kind of like, hey, I did this for a while just so I could write a book about it, but your heart's not really in it. It felt shackled in that sort of way, and at the time I'm reading, like, I don't know, John Cheever or Alice Munro, going, bloody hell, I want to write stuff like this. But I had to wait a long time to actually be allowed to write fiction, as I said.
Yeah, both great models to have, of course. And now, I mean, Unbound is quite a good name for the imprint, isn't it? You are free. You are.
Yeah, it definitely it sums it up, and I just hope, I hope they continue doing what they're doing. It's not actually that new an idea, like books were crowdfunded hundreds of years ago, and it's hard work. I think it's some people don't get their books funded. It's not the way for everyone to go, but I think it particularly works for me, with my readership and with the sort of stuff I'm trying to do, because I want to write a different kind of book each time. I don't want to, publishers used to talk about brand so much to me, and I just want to get away from that. I mean, someone will then tell you, but you have got a brand, which is you. But that's kind of like, well, no, it's not a brand. It's just you writing the book that you feel really needs to be written at this time. That's what I want to do, really. I don't want to write the same book over and over again because one's worked fairly successfully.
You hear stories about writers who've had to change their name and write under a different name because they're writing something that's not similar to what they've done in the past. And it seems such a bizarre idea, doesn't it?
I mean, I'm lucky that I haven't had to do that, really. I'm lucky just that I've been allowed to do it on this level as me. I mean, maybe it'd be okay to do it under a pseudonym. Maybe it's fun to hide under that. And maybe your imagination becomes even more free. I don't know, but I think I'm sticking with doing it under my name for now.
Stick to being Tom Cox. and you said that, you know, you're a niche writer, but I think you have so many different niches that if you add all the niches together, it's quite a lot of potential there, you know. Cats, psychedelica. Psychedelia. That's it.
That's the psychedelic thing is. I mean, I know you said with Help the Witch and Villager how they're similar in some ways. I feel that Help the Witch was kind of, that's me maybe doing a folk horror, acid folk kind of book, whereas I wanted Villager to be more like a spring summer sort of psychedelic book. It's very, and I was thinking about music a lot because the psychedelic era is very frustrating in some ways because a lot of those records, even my very favorite ones, they're very flawed because, and they have a track that really annoys you on it, like a novelty track.
Incredible String Band can be a bit like that. There can be a really grating vocal, and then the next song will be absolutely genius.
So. Yeah, some of the lyrics you want to give them a bit of a slap sometimes, but they are, when they're great, they're really, really great. And I like the kind of overreaching feeling that you get from a lot of psychedelic records where people are just, they're trying to push into this different world and it's really ambitious. They're trying to do something futuristic and mad and colorful, and they don't always get it right. It's always kind of doomed to failure. And I suppose I was trying to do that with a book. I was trying to recreate that kind of, that color palette that you get on those albums as much as you can with a book. And I don't know, maybe there's some of it that I didn't get right, but I suppose I did the best that I could at the time, which is what they did as well, really.
Yeah. Well, I thoroughly enjoyed the short stories and the novel, and I'm looking forward to seeing what you do next. Thank you ever so much for dropping into the book bag. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
You too.
So that wraps it up for another week in the book bag. I hope you've to be quiet now, Tom.
I'm sorry. I didn't realize.
He's still there in the background. If you would like to hear more, then please like and subscribe. Join me next week when I'll have another wonderful author to chat with. But for the moment, thanks for watching. Goodbye.